OverSoul 7 and the Museum of Time by Jane Roberts. Read by Martin John. Chapter 14, Dire Probability. "Hi," Seven said brightly. "Who's that with you, Window, Monarch, or Christ?" asked George, grinning. "Verily, I'm Christ just now," Window said. "That's just super," George exclaimed briskly. "All we need, I'd say." Then to Seven, "What the hell is really going on around here? Do you know? I'll be so glad to get back to my tooth and gums business tomorrow that I'm tempted to pay the patients." Seven grinned sympathetically, but George said, "No kidding, I mean it. All this shit is driving me out of my mind. None of it should have happened. Christ healing Diggs, all those hallucinations or whatever they were at the restaurant, Window thinking he's two people, Christ and some guy in the future. Tomorrow he goes back to the center. That's that." "Are you Judas?" Christ asked with mild curiosity. "No, goddammit," George replied. "I'm just a poor bemused tooth doctor." "If they crucify me," Christ began. "Will you stop that?" George interrupted. "They don't crucify people in this century anyhow." "Bless you," Christ answered. "Hell," George replied. "I like you better when you're Window." At the same time, George's voice turned quizzical. When Window thought he was Christ, aside from the pat phrases about Judas and getting crucified, there was an aura about him. Suddenly, George leaned forward and said dramatically, "You aren't really afraid of being crucified, are you? And you know I'm not Judas. What in the hell are you trying to pull? I'm mystified, I admit it." "Well," demanded a voice, "are you going to tell me or not?" George startled with surprise as Gregory Diggs came in through the open back porch door. "What is this? A convention?" George said. "I suppose you couldn't sleep either." "I wasn't about to leave you guys alone with Mr. Window here," said Gregory, leering. Then to Seven, "Well?" It's sort of a wild story," Seven said dubiously. "Try me," George responded dryly. He sat down at the kitchen table, sighing with mock despair, then grinning. "Come on, guys, give. This is an elaborate put-on." This time Seven sighed. He put down his peanut butter sandwich, spread out his hands and said, "This is it. The truth as we understand it after talking to Window Christ Monarch half the night. Ready?" "Shoot," George said. He crossed his legs. "Nothing will surprise me," he added. "Okay," Seven answered. "Window, interrupt me if I say anything you don't agree with. But it looks like this. That person," he pointed to Window, "is a combination of the characteristics that belong to Window, Christ, and Monarch. Only for some reason the characteristics are separate. He hasn't put them together. Now he can heal. We know that. He claims to come from the future or to see into it when he's Monarch." "Yeah," George said, with a silly, unbelieving grin. "I am Monarch," Window said suddenly and gently. "Oh, Christ," George sputtered, before Seven shushed him. At the same time, Diggs poked George and pointed to his own lap where a small cassette recorder was balanced on his knees. He turned it on to record. Window Monarch's face was grave. He said softly, "I'd like to believe that somehow or other I was speaking with George. The George who initiated the codicils into the world. Are you the George?" George couldn't rid his face of its embarrassed perplexity. He wanted to say no, and I'm not Judas either. But with some surprise he heard his voice respond differently. "Hell, I know about the codicils," he said. As he spoke, George heard Seven gasp. At the same time, Window's eyes certainly seemed to belong to someone else. They stared urgently at George. "I had the worst feeling that something had happened in the past," Monarch said softly. "As if probabilities were changing. As if I had to contact you in your present time. I'll try again soon. I'm not as good at this as I should be." As the words faded, Window's eyes lost the intentness. Himself again, he said, "That time I almost saw something through someone else's eyes." But Seven was on his feet. "George, what do you know about the codicils?" he asked. "Quickly." "What is this?" asked George, bewildered. When he said codicils, I just remembered seeing the word on the title page of one of my grandfather's old journals in the attic someplace. That's all. The codicils. That was the title of one of his journals. He labeled them all. I don't even know if they're still up there." And Seven cried, "They've got to be." When Seven was with mortals, he had to act like them as much as possible so as not to give himself away. It was with considerable relief, then, that he rushed up to the attic, after getting George's permission to search for his grandfather's old journals. George, Window, and Diggs were off to bed in the second-floor bedrooms. Seven went into the attic, turned on the light, and closed the door behind him. The steady thumping of his heart distracted him. "All the racket!" he cried. So he stepped out of his 20th century body after arranging it neatly on the old cot that stood by the window. He wondered if that cot was in another time occupied by another body, George the First, for example. Seven looked around. What he saw was the dirty, cluttered 20th century attic, with boxes stashed all over, antique furniture standing at odd angles, and the smell of dust mingling with the scent of lilacs that came in through the open window. It was then that Seven spied the old desk. It was the same one that had stood polished and gleaming in the attic study of George the First. Quickly, Seven went rummaging through the drawers until finally he found what he was looking for. It was too much to ask for, he thought, grinning, as he came upon the neat stack of old journals. Still, Seven paused before opening the one at hand. Was their author, George the First, invisibly there? And if he was, would his desk drawers open as if by an invisible hand? Or would his journals and desk drawers remain motionless? because as Seven thought of opening the first journal, he felt very close to George the First. Close enough to touch him, in fact. Seven paused, staring. He studied the positions of the old journals, now scattered on the floor, and looked at the dusty surface of the desk. Everything seemed complete 20th century except, Seven squinted his eyes, except for one tiny circle of air. Well, the circle wasn't tiny exactly, he thought, and he wasn't even sure how he knew it was different from all of the other air in the attic room. But it was. Seven stared at this shiny segment of space suspiciously and hopefully at the same time. He simply had to discover what George the First knew about the codicils. Was that odd, super-transparent circle of space somehow connected with the same space in the late 1890s? Because now Seven felt closer than ever to George the First. And more than that, he smelled a difference between that significant spot of air and all the rest of the room. Seven grinned. He had it. His inner senses were much more acute than the physical ones that came with his body, of course, and now he realized that the smell of dust and lilacs was everywhere else in the attic, except in that circle of space he was staring at. He stepped closer, thinking that here, for some reason, the times of both Georges must intersect. In the next moment, though, Seven stepped back so quickly that he almost fell over, because suddenly a very real and solid red-sleeved lower arm and red-cuffed hand appeared in the center of the circle of space. It reached out and picked up the nearest journal that Seven hadn't yet placed with the others. And as the hand, surely George the First, grabbed the journal, the dust instantly vanished from it. Its color brightened, and the journal looked quite new. "George! George!" Seven yelled, mentally, since he was out of his body. No one answered. Instead, the hand flipped open the journal and began to write with a fountain pen. "George, what do you know about the codicils?" Seven cried, again getting no response. At the same time, almost, Seven gasped as he saw what was happening. The effect was somewhat like looking at a round television screen whose stations automatically synchronized places and times. That is, the round circle in space shimmered. George's hand and the journal disappeared. There were wavy lines and warps in the circle, and then George's hand appeared again. Only this time it was obvious that the hand was part of a statue, one of George that must stand in the 25th Century Museum. Seven's head was swimming. He concentrated as hard as he could on George in the late 1890s, and after some more wavy lines, the circle in space changed. There was George's hand again, already having written several sentences in the open journal. The picture stabilized. As quickly as he could, Seven began to read the sentences, even as George's hand wrote in neat script. June 2nd, 1892. Tonight, having finally achieved an out-of-body condition, I first found myself in the western bedroom, only the time seemed to be somewhere in the future. I'm convinced that some electrical devices were in evidence, far superior to our current knowledge of that new field, though I wasn't quick enough to discover their workings. In a strange vision, I also saw a man sleeping in a bed where my bed should be. My intuitions told me that this was a future relative, and surely there was a family resemblance. This episode reminds me that a few days ago, in an altered state of consciousness while sniffing gas, I encountered a man who told me I had a grandson. Obviously, I do not, and my son isn't married. Yet, it is possible that I actually saw a future grandson sleeping in the room that is now my bedroom when I use it. When Sarah is away, of course. I practically live in this attic hideaway except for handling my patients very nicely, I must admit, in the morning hours. 7 frowned. That was as far as George got on the page, and his hand was now in the way. What about the codicils? And where was Cyprus? It was obvious that she'd simplified his mission considerably. He was worried about everything. George's hand moved down a few lines. Impatiently, 7 read. The other adventure was equally mysterious, and I'm not sure how much hallucination was involved. I found myself again, it seemed, in the western bedroom in some distant future, only the room was a museum piece. The furniture was an odd mixture of what is now in my bedroom and the furniture that I saw in the previous instance. People who certainly seemed alive were staring at the room. They were dressed in the flimsiest of apparel, and though I'm far from being narrowly moralistic, I was somewhat shocked and at first thought I might be in a brothel. George's hand was in the way again, and 7 almost cried with impatience. If he saw George's hand, did George sense that someone was watching him? Could he, 7, reach into that magic space and pull the journal back? 7 grinned, imagining George's startled reaction. He'd probably scream, "Zounds!" And, anyway, what good would that do? 7 wondered. None, so he waited. George's hand was trembling. He began to write in a faster, agitated manner. Now we come to the heart of the matter. A man's voice came out of the walls in some way unknown to me, but surely some future development of the gramophone was involved. The voice spoke about the codicils, with a significance of tone that gave the phrase the codicils great import. Something was said, if I remembered correctly, about the George, or in the time of George, or words to that effect. But the impact of those words upon myself was unprecedented. I felt them to the core of my soul. The entire affair may be symbolic rather than literal, of course, and I've had enough experience with states of consciousness to know how insidious hallucinations can be, if you accept them as real. But ever since, and here the handwriting became very agitated, I began my adventures in consciousness. I felt that there was a reason for them. And tonight I knew that I have to discover the codicils, whatever they are. My only clue is in the distant future just mentioned, and I have no assurance that I can return there. I tried several out-of-body methods before achieving success last time, Did the last one I used somehow propel me into other times as well? Of course, I'll experiment further, for even as I write, a sense of urgency that I do not understand overtakes me, and in a week my wife and son will return from Europe, in which case my opportunities for experimentation will be drastically reduced. And, Seven thought, in a week Jean and the kids would return to George III. Seven couldn't believe what he was reading. George hadn't discovered the codicils yet, and Seven had hoped to learn them from George, to give to Window in the 20th century. With dismay, Seven stared again at the journal page. The circle in space barely contained it, and again George's hand was in the way. But again Seven managed to glimpse the date at the top of the page, June 2nd, 1892, and he shook his head in confusion. It was June 2nd, 1982, in the attic, and in the world of George, Josephine, Gregory, and Window. Then apparently George I had had his out-of-body encounters while Window and Diggs sat with Seven in the kitchen just a short time ago, and before George got out of bed to see what was going on. These thoughts came and went, but since Seven realized that George hadn't discovered the codicils, a sense of foreboding began to assail him. At first his dismay merely grew sharper. Then, however, the circle of space in which the journal appeared began to darken, shimmer, and tremble until finally it seemed to whirl into darkness altogether. It became a black circle of space, darker than the space about it, and somehow threatening. If the codicils weren't discovered in time, Seven wondered, what probable worlds might vanish? Could they actually disappear? And how could the codicils appear in the 25th century and form the basis of a world, if they hadn't already been planted in the past? Seven looked around anxiously. The black circle was expanding, while at the same time it grew even blacker, and more concentrated, and more compelling. Seven thought he heard Cypress cry, "Seven! Look away, quick!" But it was too late. Events began to happen and unhappen with such rapidity that Seven instinctively knew he was in trouble. In a flash he dismissed his own mental image of himself so that he was in visible consciousness, and just in time, as he said to Cypress later, because that circle or hole or whatever was like a multi-dimensional meat grinder. Any kind of form at all would be, well, ground up. His consciousness actually twirled topsy-turvy, turned inside out, sideways. If consciousness had a shape, it was pulled out of it, so that Seven first felt long, then short, then big, then small, then absolutely not there. The circle that had opened up through the universe itself, it seemed, was like an eternally ravenous animal of space. Seven felt as if he was falling down some infinite tunnel. Even that idea didn't fit, though, because Seven felt that time was so scrambled that while he was falling through the tunnel on the one hand, on the other hand, another part of him was poised eternally on its threshold, staring, unable to move. And that part didn't know about this tumbling through the tunnel self at all. And worse, as fast as these events kept happening, they kept unhappening at the same time, so that yet another part of him felt as if he was tumbling back the other way through the hole he'd just entered. Not only that, but somewhere along the way, space had vanished. That is, it felt as if space knotted up into itself, or he himself was knotting up into space, so that even his thoughts had no psychological room between them but kept bumping into one another, sticking to each other like glue until there was just one clump of thoughts like porcupine quills. And then that vanished. Psychological silence. Seven knew he was thinking at an incredibly fast rate, but somehow no thoughts registered. He was himself, and he felt oddly cool and quiet, though he had nothing to judge himself against. He existed in reference to nothing. So how did he know he existed? He thought the question, but it didn't register, and all seven knew was that his thinking seemed to exist apart from himself, with no connection to himself. And, at the same time, in this silence, he felt that undurable energy surrounded him, making energy falls instead of, say, waterfalls, and that this energy felt solid even though its motion blurred the edges of his consciousness. This particular experience seemed endless. He kept falling through this chute with the moving walls of energy, yet knowing this, he didn't feel as if he were falling, or rather, he felt suspended, unmoving and moving at once. Even the darkness around him moved, varied in intensity, trembled, formed shapes of darkness within darkness. Seven was beyond fear. He even began to feel a part of whatever strange process was occurring, as if he and the process were one. His thoughts had felt compressed and inaccessible to him. Now they began to gyrate within his consciousness, to swirl. Simultaneously, he felt a fantastic pull from some distance in front of him, and suddenly he did feel as if he was falling, and falling fast. In the next moment, Seven saw a rim of light so bright that he thought physical eyes could never stand it. And before he could even begin to wonder about this, there was a light, floating sensation, an odd popping sound, and Seven found himself standing in what he knew at once was another universe altogether. Seven gulped, figuratively speaking. He was definitely in another universe or un-universe, he thought, for he sensed negation everywhere. The atmosphere was particularly suffocating, the air heavy and motionless. Yet the environment was physical enough. There were ugly dwarf bushes everywhere, miles of grayish sand, and the sky was a threatening purple-gray, with fog reaching from a few feet above the ground, hanging almost motionless for what seemed to be miles, at least before the thick levels of purple-gray sky began. It was difficult to say whether it was night or day. The place seemed to exist in an eternal twilight. The mountains in the distance were devoid of growth. their naked rock and dirt ledges looking like eerie steps to nowhere. The longer Seven stood where he was, the more aware he became of the heavy atmosphere. Even though he was without a body, he felt as if he weighed tons. Or, no, he felt as if his thoughts weighed tons. As if his very psychological being was too heavy a burden to bear. Anxious, he looked more closely around him. He was on some kind of ancient fortification on the second or third floor, for above him now he saw half-destroyed floors, and he was standing only on a fairly small ledge, obviously all that was left of this part of the fortress. It was made of wood, much of it now rotten, and as Seven squinted in the distance, he realized that the ruins of hundreds of such structures lay in piles and heaps on the gray ground, blending so well with this weathered world that he hadn't distinguished them as structures at all. A glint of metal at Seven's feet caught his eye. He squinted down at it sideways. It was a broken-off metal plaque. Seven read the weathered lettering. Skirmish 541, World War Roman numeral 5. World War 5? The implications made Seven dizzy. The structures or their remains were fortresses then. When he thought that, Seven's inner senses showed him a sudden scene. Thousands of men and women living and fighting in this area thousands of years ago, building and rebuilding the fortresses. Literally a decayed species, dying of despair. The emotion was so strong that Seven cried out as he realized what this world, this universe was. Created by man's despair, it was a future probable universe in which man answered none of the questions that plagued him in George's time. Seven looked up again. There were no floating cities in the sky, either. No evidence of man's technology or adventuresomeness. In this reality, the species didn't last that long. It was then that Seven noticed the silence. Not one bird call or insect sound. No murmuring of the wind. He looked down. No anthills. It was a final version of the dire visions he'd seen earlier. And Seven knew that no one could withstand that atmosphere of despair. It caught at his own consciousness. He felt his own thoughts darkening. Desolation stained even his inner vision until he feared that his spiritual sight would be forever dimmed by a cast of darkness. Was this what mortals felt when they experienced despair? Did George feel that way? Or Window? Or Diggs? Or Josephine? As if nothing mattered and no meaning existed. They never said that to themselves or to each other, Seven thought, confused. And Monarch. In the instant Seven thought of Monarch, he remembered the codicils. This, he realized, was a universe in which the codicils didn't exist and were never discovered, in which they remained psychologically invisible to man. But what about Christianity? 7 wondered, even as he struggled against the growing closeness of the air. What about Christianity? Suddenly, brighteningly, in his mind's eye, 7 saw Windows speaking as Christ, as he had done in George's kitchen earlier, and then speaking for Monarch. And as he saw this inner vision, 7 cried out. For Window was himself Window, and yet a personification of the people of George's time. Christianity as it had been known was dead-ended. The 20th century world still wasn't big enough to accept miracles as fact, and so Christ became a delusion, and man had to take the steps that would lead him beyond what he was, to become Monarch. Man had to find the codicils. 7 felt more helpless and forlorn than he ever remembered being. How could one soul, even a 7, discover such a vital message, when he didn't even know what the codicils said exactly, or how to find them? And if he didn't, did it mean that this terrible world would be the future of George's Earth? The sense of responsibility felt crushing, yet 7 told himself that he'd accept it, if he had to, if there was no other way, if... "I'll find the codicils," he shouted, and as he did, he gasped in astonishment. He felt the air get closer, but now it had collected tightly around him so that it formed a circle filled, it seemed, with new magnetic darkness. And before he could understand what was happening, he began to fall once more through the tunneling dimensions from which he'd only shortly emerged. Space turned into time, time into space. 7's thoughts suddenly had incredible mass, and then seemed to disappear altogether. In between, he told himself that he didn't care what happened. He'd find the codicils. Only once, when his thoughts appeared clearly, did he wonder nostalgically where George's world was now, and the attic room where his body still lay neatly on the 20th century couch. Did George's world even exist? Was it there to return to? In chapter 14, peace, light, and love. Aloha.